From the moment Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, the country that had once prided itself on law and constitutional procedure began to change in ways that were swift, methodical, and irreversible. What followed was not merely a change of government, it was the systematic conversion of state institutions and ordinary administrative practices into instruments of repression and mass violence. Central to that conversion was the development, expansion, and radical transformation of a broad system of detention, a network of camps that, in less than a decade, evolved from improvised local prisons into an industrialized apparatus of incarceration, forced labor, and murder. This video explores how the camp system developed, how it operated, who ran it, and what it consumed. It examines daily life in the camps, the relationships between the state and private industry, the role of bureaucracy and professional complicity, and finally the aftermath: liberation, justice, memory, and the lessons that must endure. Our aim is not simply to recount facts. It is to trace the mechanisms by which law, language, and routine can be repurposed to devastating ends, and to reflect on the responsibilities borne by individuals and institutions in guarding against that conversion. In the chaotic months that followed the Reichstag fire in February 1933, the Nazi movement and its paramilitary wings moved with ruthless speed. The state unleashed arrests of communists, socialists, trade unionists, and anyone labeled an enemy of the state. This was not yet a polished system. It was improvisational, opportunistic, and brutal. Local officials, police units, and party militias commandeered empty barracks, warehouses, and fortresses, transforming them into holding spaces. Those temporary sites would harbor the first wave of prisoners subjected to beatings, starvation, forced labor, and torture. The violence served a clear purpose. It silenced immediate opposition and signaled a new political order in which dissent would not be tolerated. Dachau, opened in March 1933 near Munich, became the prototype for the camps to come. Initially conceived as a facility to hold political prisoners, Dachau quickly acquired a standardized layout, administrative structures, and disciplinary routines that would be replicated elsewhere. Rows of barracks, watchtowers, barbed wire, and hard labor became part of a template for control. Over the remainder of the 1930s, the regime progressively centralized administration of these facilities under the SS, a process that both professionalized and intensified the machinery of imprisonment. By 1939, 7 major concentration camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Neuengamme, Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, and Ravensbrück, formed the backbone of an expanding system. What began as a tool for crushing political opponents gradually widened into an apparatus for disciplining and segregating a much broader range of people. The regime's categories of enemies multiplied. Common criminals and those regarded as asocial, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexual men, Roma and Sinti, and others deemed undesirable were swept into the same institutional framework. Administrative classification became a technique of domination. Colored triangles sewn into prisoner uniforms encoded the reason for arrest and assisted officials in sorting, controlling, and dehumanizing inmates. These visible marks were both symbolic and practical. They reduced complex human lives to bureaucratic categories designed to justify different treatments. The camp system evolved steadily, then decisively, in response to war and ideology. By 1939, the apparatus had become multifunctional. It functioned as political repression, as an engine of economic exploitation, and as a tool of racial and social policy. Historians identify different but interconnected camp types that reflect their distinct administrative logics: early improvised detention sites, centrally administered concentration camps under SS authority, forced labor camps and countless subcamps integrated into industrial production, transit and collection camps used to concentrate and deport populations, prisoner of war camps, specialized internment facilities for Roma and Sinti, and finally extermination camps engineered for mass murder. Forced labor increasingly defined the daily reality of many prisoners. As Germany's war economy intensified, the regime sought labor to sustain armaments production, mining, and construction, often at the precise moment when free labor was scarce. Prisoners were shipped from main camps to sub-camps built beside factories, quarries, and military installations. There, men and women worked under grueling conditions, insufficient food, inadequate clothing, exposure to the elements, and relentless oversight by guards. The enterprise was inherently disposable. Prisoners were inputs to be consumed. If they collapsed, became ill, or could not meet quotas, they were often removed from production and sent to extermination or weeding out facilities. Over time, the borderline between forced labor and killing vanished. Work itself became a mechanism of attrition. Transit and collection camps were the logistical linchpins of the genocidal process. Jews and other targeted populations from across Europe were concentrated into ghettos and local holding facilities, then moved via rail to transit centers where they endured weeks of overcrowded, unsanitary conditions while transport schedules were organized. In the architecture of genocide, these way stations turned movement into a bureaucratic rhythm. Manifests, quotas, transport orders, and timetables coordinated the flow of human beings like cargo. The psychological cruelty of indefinite suspense, being held en route to an unknown fate, was itself a deliberate instrument of terror. Between 1941 and 1943, the regime's apparatus reached its most catastrophic form. Extermination camps optimized for killing at scale. Primarily constructed in occupied Poland, places such as Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the Birkenau sector of Auschwitz were designed to move people from arrival to murder with maximum efficiency. The process followed a terrifying choreography: disembarkation from rail cars, immediate separation by selection, directed movement into gas chambers, and subsequent disposal of the bodies by cremation or burial. Auschwitz-Birkenau, in particular, embodied a hybrid model that combined labor exploitation with systematic killing. Selections upon arrival decided who would be used for work and who would be murdered within hours. It is essential to understand that the Holocaust was as much a bureaucratic and technical undertaking as it was a moral catastrophe. Ordinary administrative tools, lists, quotas, timetables, manifests, warehouses for confiscated belongings, were repurposed to serve lethal ends. The state's organizational capacities, its rail network, and the routines of office work were mobilized to realize extermination. This mundane infrastructure made the violence predictable, efficient, and horrifyingly effective. Millions of men, women, and children were killed through a system that married ordinary procedures to extraordinary evil. Life inside the camps was governed by humiliation, deprivation, and relentless violence. Prisoners slept in overcrowded barracks on straw or planks, lacked adequate clothing, and suffered from unsanitary conditions that facilitated the spread of disease. Food rations were deliberately insufficient. The labor day could stretch beyond 12 hours. The work was exhausting and dangerous, from quarrying stone to maintaining munitions production. Guards enforced orders with beatings, arbitrary executions, and the deliberate withholding of care. Medical attention, when it existed, was episodic and often cruel. In certain camps, medical experiments were a cover for torture and murder. Selections conducted by physicians became instruments directing life and death. Within the camp population, the SS instituted a hierarchy that the Nazis exploited to fracture solidarity. A small group of prisoner functionaries, known as kapos, were granted limited authority in exchange for enforcing discipline among fellow inmates. The kapos system produced morally fraught relationships. Some kapos used their positions to protect others or to share food. Others became instruments of brutality. The system of privileged prisoner roles deepened divisions and intensified the regime's capacity to control without committing every violent act personally. The complicity of professionals, physicians, lawyers, engineers, and bureaucrats, was a distinguishing feature of the regime's capacity to destroy. Medical professionals participated in selections and experiments. Engineers and managers designed facilities and coordinated production. Lawyers drafted emergency decrees and provided legal cover for extra-legal measures. After the war, the doctor's trial and other proceedings sought to hold some of these actors to account. The trials established crucial legal precedents, including the concepts of crimes against humanity and medical ethics codified in the Nuremberg Medical Code. Yet justice was partial. Many perpetrators escaped full accountability, and the complicity of entire institutions left deep scars on professions and societies. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 intensified the regime's cruelty. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Their treatment was staggeringly brutal. Large numbers died from starvation, exposure, or deliberate mass shootings. The racialized ideology that underpinned Nazi policy categorized Soviet prisoners and Slavic civilians as inferior and therefore eligible for exterminatory neglect. The mass killings on the Eastern Front, carried out by Einsatzgruppen and other units, were part of a broader genocidal logic that informed both the killing of civilians in occupied territories and the operation of camps. The camp system also depended on economic motives and collaboration between the state and private firms. Industrial giants and smaller companies benefited from coerced labor. Some companies built factories adjacent to camps or paid the SS for labor allocations. The economic incentives of wartime production created a perverse calculus. Maximize output while minimizing costs, including the cost of prisoner well-being. These arrangements turned camps into sources of profit and deepened corporate entanglement with the criminality of the regime. The post-war reckoning with corporate responsibility was uneven, and the legacies of collaboration complicated efforts to achieve full moral and legal accountability. As the Allied advances accelerated in 1944 and 1945, the regime confronted the collapse of the territory it controlled. Rather than permit liberation of camp populations in place, authorities embarked on forced evacuations. Men, women, and children were marched from camps into the German interior in brutal winter conditions. These death marches subjected already starving and exhausted prisoners to additional days or weeks of exposure, brutality, and summary executions for those who could not keep pace. Trains sometimes carried prisoners in sealed wagons with no food or water. The ostensible motives behind evacuations varied: concealment of evidence, ideological refusal to countenance liberation, or attempts to preserve exploitable labor. But their predictable result was mass death. When Allied forces liberated camps in 1944 and 1945, they encountered scenes that defied easy comprehension: skeletal survivors, unburied corpses, crematoria and gas chambers, and warehouses containing victims' clothing and personal effects. Early liberations at Majdanek, and most dramatically, Auschwitz-Birkenau, exposed not only the scale of mass murder, but the industrial means by which it had been carried out. Photographs and film footage taken by soldiers and journalists served as incontrovertible evidence of systemic atrocity and have since become central to the historical record. Liberation did not end suffering. Survivors faced immediate medical crises: typhus, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and required long periods of rehabilitation. Displacement was widespread. Entire families had been destroyed, communities erased, and social networks severed. For some victim groups, recognition of their suffering lagged. Homosexual men, for example, often remained stigmatized by pre-existing laws and social prejudice, complicating their post-war recovery. Roma and Sinti face similar neglect and marginalization in many countries. The moral and material dimensions of recovery, restitution, rehabilitation, and recognition presented profound challenges. The post-war pursuit of justice took many forms. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg prosecuted top Nazi leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Other trials, military tribunals, national proceedings, and specialized cases addressed specific crimes such as medical experimentation or the mistreatment of prisoners. These efforts were groundbreaking but incomplete. Geopolitical tensions, evidentiary difficulties, and the sheer scale of culpability meant that many perpetrators escaped punishment. Still, the trials established important legal precedents, affirming that individuals and organizations can be held responsible for atrocities even when operating under state authority. In the decades that followed, former camps were repurposed as sites of remembrance and education. Preserved barracks, reconstructed crematoria, and interpretive exhibitions served dual functions. They memorialize the dead and instruct new generations. Survivors' testimonies, archival documents, and scholarly research have shaped collective memory. National practices of commemoration have varied. In some countries, robust public engagement and education have maintained the memory of the camps, while in others, political and social forces have rendered remembrance contested or incomplete. Yet across these differences, the imperative is consistent: to preserve memory as a bulwark against denial and distortion. Remembering the camps is not merely an act of historical preservation, it is an ethical responsibility. It requires honoring victims, acknowledging survivors, combating denial, and teaching future generations about the conditions that made such atrocities possible. Memory must be complemented with legal and civic safeguards. The erosion of democratic institutions, the capture of professions by partisan ideologies, and the normalization of exclusionary administrative practices are warning signs that deserve vigilant attention. The Nazi camp system demonstrates how modern institutions, administrations, corporations, and professional bodies can be mobilized to produce cruelty on an industrial scale. It is a cautionary tale about the capacity of ordinary people and ordinary practices to become conduits of atrocity when combined with ideological fervor and state power. Yet it also testifies to human resilience. Clandestine acts of solidarity, spiritual observances carried out in secret, and occasional uprisings that asserted dignity even in the most abject conditions. As Martin Niemöller's famous lines remind us, indifference is itself a path to collective peril. First they came for the communists, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That admonition encapsulates the ethical urgency of remembrance. The memory of those who suffered in the camps should be a moral touchstone, an obligation to speak, to act, and to protect. Preserving democratic institutions, enforcing professional ethics, training citizens to recognize bureaucratic and rhetorical signs of exclusion, and supporting the memory and testimony of survivors are not abstract tasks. They are practical defenses against the reemergence of structures that turn confinement and exclusion into instruments of mass destruction. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most defining moments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss another deep dive into our past.